Hello, so this lecture is the follow-up to week 6, which focused on Francis Harper and Booker T. Washington. At this point I feel that I want to start with what I think is kind of a defense of Booker T. Washington. I think that for people who are reading him for the first time, who are not necessarily familiar with the historical context of the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction, then it is frequently too easy to dismiss Washington as someone who was perhaps overly compromising to white perspectives. I think dismissing him this easily, however, is something that overlooks several of his ideas, which were also very important. Many of you in your comments, you pointed out the many practical aspects of Washington's philosophy, such as his emphasis on thrift and modesty. And like the other slave narratives we've read, Up From Slavery is very heavily influenced by Washington's audience or audiences. We have to pay attention to who it was that Washington was writing to, and how that decision of who he was writing to shaped his writing style. So Washington was writing to at least 3 different audiences at the same time. So on the one hand, he is speaking to a poor black audience who are newly freed former slaves. And this group was largely uneducated, largely living in poverty. And he wants to speak with them in an effort to bring them into the modern world. He wants to teach them the most advanced science. He wants to teach them the ways to become good mechanics and farmers. And in speaking to this group, he uses certain kinds of images and certain kinds of tones in order to address them. On the other hand, Washington is also trying to reach out to a very wealthy white donor class that he's had some experience with. And in order to reach this white donor class, it's necessary for Washington to consider that at this time in history, where African Americans had little to no actual power, and where all that power was in the hands of whites who had no significant friendliness to be offered towards African Americans, Washington had to address them in a way that could encourage them to support his causes, while at the same time would not drive them away with them focusing on, would not drive them away from black interests and black causes. So many of you guys pointed out the idea that Washington said, for example, that slavery was just as beneficial for the slave as for the slave master, or the slave learned as much during slavery. And the reason why Washington makes those kind of statements is because he's trying to convince his white donor class that they are not giving funds to a group of black people who harbor long-term resentment against their masters. Washington has to convince these donors that black people are not looking back at slavery with anger, and instead they're looking forward. They're looking to change things and make things different, and therefore it's okay for this wealthy white class to give them funds to change their conditions. If Washington would have written more confrontationally, if Washington would have written with more anger and resentment, which was perhaps true in the black community, then he wouldn't have found the same donor base, and he wouldn't have been allowed to really even operate in the Tuskegee situation. The community around him would not have allowed African Americans to speak in such a way without bringing violence of lynching down upon them. So Washington is writing to this white donor class and trying to persuade them to help. He's writing to poor blacks newly freed from slavery and trying to make them modern. He's also writing to a nascent intellectual and political class, meaning that there had been black people agitating for political causes in abolitionism since the founding of the country. But in the period after the Civil War, the period during the Reconstruction, there is a new growth of African American political concerns. And as the vote is something which had just opened up for African Americans, they had just gained the right to vote, suddenly how one casts one's vote, how one thinks about political issues becomes more of a dominant point of argument in discussions about black experience. So Washington is attempting to address all 3 of these audiences, and this leads him to make some compromises, and these compromises certainly deserve our criticism. Washington, at least in Up From Slavery, makes statements which really just can't be taken at face value. You have to look at them and say that Washington is trying to persuade this particular audience, and that's why he makes these kind of statements. I think that Washington, for those who wish to study Washington, looking at examples of his papers and the arguments and things that he did behind the scenes show that Washington was not simply just believing the things that he wrote. He definitely sees this as a tool. He sees his as a performance in order to gain influence in the African American community, in order to convince white donors to donate to him. So Washington's statements have to be seen within that particular historical context. So even though he makes these compromises which deserve significant criticism, at the same time, during this period of significant oppression, Washington is able to carve out a niche for the preservation of black culture at a time when that culture was most at risk. So I want to just convince us all that dismissing Washington is to undervalue him, and that Washington does have some significant contributions that were made to African American culture as preserving African American culture during a period when it was at most at risk. So one of you asked what I think Washington would think of the present day. That's always kind of an interesting question to consider. And of course there's no real right or wrong answer to that. But I think that Washington would see both cause for celebration and alarm at the same time. So in the contemporary American society, there is a significant but still fragile black middle class. And I think that Washington would be impressed by the kinds of social and political movements that black people have achieved in contemporary American society. At the same time that he would see this, and I think be moved towards happiness for it, at the same time I think he would be dismayed by the amount of poverty, illiteracy, and incarceration rates that African Americans currently face as well. So on the one hand, Washington would see advancement. On the other end, he would see a retrograde kind of assessment of what has happened to Black America. To turn to the question of passing, which occurs in Iola Leroy, as I said previously in the lecture that I posted, I think the book of Iola Leroy is at times contradictory or ambiguous in how it addresses the topic of color difference within African American culture. Harper has her characters explicitly state that they idealize this view of devotion to darker-skinned black people. So when we see Iola's brother and Miss Delaney get married at the end, and Miss Delaney is a dark-skinned African-American, the book celebrates her in particular as being sort of the source of the brightest future for African-Americans. But at the same time that she says that, her primary character is Iola, and the people who are most commonly around Iola are all characters who are, visually, they look white, even though they claim blackness. They are all characters who are able to pass, even if they choose not to do so. So Harper presents this kind of ambiguous kind of position. And I don't find this ambiguity to be a failing on her part, but rather I think it's an example of the kind of rift that has existed in African American communities since the earliest days when house slaves and field slaves were separated. Typically, you had slaves who were slaves in the house, who had more access to privilege, more access to resources. Frequently, slaves in the house were related to their masters. They were more likely to be light-skinned mulatto of mixed race. So, the class division that existed between the black masses and the black middle class continues into the present day, and it is also still framed around the notion of lighter skin versus darker skin. Even though in contemporary society we say that we don't hold those values as much in the foreground, they are still things which are still present. If you look at images of black people in the popular media, you still see them tending towards lighter skinned black people as opposed to darker skinned black people. And I would argue, even though I don't have statistics for it, I would argue that if you look at statistics of poverty and incarceration and so forth, you would find that those are very much mapped and aligned with notions of darker skin versus lighter skin. So this is still an issue that we have to deal with in the present day, that we still have to negotiate. I think many of you had some good points on how ideas about passing might make themselves evident in contemporary society. And there were some interesting posts on cross-cultural aspects of passing that I thought were very interesting. So some people discussed issues of passing, say, in Mexican-American culture or other ethnic groups, and how people pass within and without of those groups. One of the terms or phrases that I saw in some of your writing that I thought was an interesting one was the phrase passing for black. And I think that's an interesting statement, because normally people don't think of the term passing in that sense. People pass for white. People are seen to be authentically black, and then you pass for white because you're really black and you're passing to something else. But I think the phrase passing for black is one that some people have used in other contexts, and although I don't think that either Francis Harper or Booker T. Washington would really recognize that term, or that term really applies to what their arguments were, I think that in some contemporary discussions of ethnicity and race, that the term passing for black really kind of gets at the socially constructed nature of blackness. I think it's also a useful term for highlighting not only the white impositions on what blackness means, but also those impositions that are created by black folks and other groups as well. So everyone has a stake in determining what does blackness mean. And so if you're passing for black, you are trying to support or trying to align yourself with those impositions. I think the phrase passing for black, if you're interested in that as a topic, a good, interesting source to look at is a recent play called Passing Strange. And it was released as a film by Spike Lee in 2011. It's a Broadway stage play, however. And in that play, it's about an African American who moves to Europe, and he says that he is passing for black. It's a very interesting play that looks at what that term might mean. So, on the whole, I think I just wanted to summarize by saying that I do think that Booker T. Washington does have some valuable things for contemporary audiences to read, although we do have to recognize how his rhetorical decisions were shaped by his audience, and also that we probably shouldn't take those positions overly seriously, that to some degree Washington is playing a game to try and present something to one set of audiences that will then allow him to get the economic funds and the influence that he needs to shape and improve African American lives. So, and I also think that the issue of passing is an interesting one, which we will see again in later works in our class. It is a consistent theme in African American literature that really looks at the question of race and what race might mean. So, I just wanted to summarize and close on those 2 points, and thank you very much, and thanks.